Wow, it's going to be a better turnout every year. This is good. Some interest in uranium. See a couple of folks that were also at London for World Nuclear Association last week. I think they'll probably affirm that it was a rather optimistic, buoyant crowd, and even the price index for uranium that came out of the producers was up 30% in the next 7 years. And that's heavily influenced by the consumer, that is the nuclear utilities. And it's really unusual to see that sort of growth forecast. For the first time, it involves some small modular reactors. And hopefully you can get some sense of that market if you aren't familiar with it and see where we're going. Really still at the beginning stages, I think. Usual disclaimer. As you may or may not know, it's one thing the U.S. Congress agrees on, both sides, is support for nuclear. That's about the only thing they do agree on, other than disagreeing on everything else. Obviously, you can't get to zero net without nuclear power. We just can't. Everyone talks about fusion. It's 30 years out. The biggest deficit in uranium is in the U.S. Just as a little note, 47 million pounds used last year against roughly 200,000 produced, which was up from about 9,000 the year before. In essence, zero. And that is about 50% of that need is coming through the port of St. Petersburg, Russia. So the U.S. is where we're based. It's the biggest need. And we're also well aware of the green aspects, so we're 100% dedicated to in situ recovery. And we've built our team around it, as well as our project base. And with the in situ, about 56–60% of the world's uranium is produced that way now, but most of that's produced with acid injection. We produce with oxygen injection and a little baking soda. Here again, much more environmentally friendly. This is the old supply chart. It's probably going to be modified now after WNA, but even this showed a pretty robust need. That orange is the supply gap, and that was without small modular reactors, which have, as I say, been factored into WNA's projections for the first time. I think the key on that is nobody really knows how much it's going to be or when, but it will equal conventional reactors. I just can't tell you if it's in 10 or 20 or 30 years. And right now there's just no place for it to come from. Here again, we're focused entirely in South Texas to start with. We do have a pipeline of production projects going into Wyoming and South Dakota and ultimately New Mexico. Our immediate goal is to attain a 3 million pound a year run rate by the end of 3 years. First production coming on before this year's out at the Rosita plant in Texas, where we've renovated an existing plant. We own 3 of only 10 complete and 11 partially built ISR plants in the U.S. 2 of those are essentially operational. Alta Mesa, our big one, will be coming on in the first quarter of 24. Here again, industry-leading experts. Our sales strategy is to be about 50% exposed to spot, and about 50% to contract, through floor and ceiling type arrangements, although the first few years were a lot more heavily contracted. Market cap's approaching 400 million, probably is with current stock price. You can see the options there. Marketable securities and uranium purchase contract has changed. We've exercised that and delivered into a contract, so that's the one note that would be different here. As you can see, most of the folks on the board are not spring chicken. We're missing 2 or 3 rounds of technical expertise in the uranium business because, quite frankly, we haven't had a buoyant uranium industry in the U.S. since 1980. The last year the U.S. was self-sufficient in uranium. So we have the ability to be self-sufficient. Just like everything else, we outsourced it. But Paul Goranson, our CEO, couldn't have a better guy. He's built the last 3 ISR plants in the U.S., formerly president of Cameco Resources, long stint with Rio Algam, recently with Uranerts Energy Fuels. And in our global search, he was head and shoulders above anyone else, and we're just thrilled to get him to come on board about 3 years ago. Dennis Stover, previous CEO, he's still our chief technical officer. He's one of the 2 originators of the in situ process, holding a number of patents. Richard Cherry, Mark Paliza, both extensive histories in ISR. Mark in particular, 40 years in South Texas primarily, with a bit in Wyoming. Bill Harris joined our company, our predecessor company, Energy Metals Corp, as the outside Sarbanes-Oxley when we went to the New York Stock Exchange, and he's stayed with the group ever since. And Susan Hoxie-Key, our most recent board member, she's a nuclear physicist joining us from the Southern Company, who's the only U.S. company to put a new reactor into service in the last 20 years, having just commissioned Vogtle 3, and will be commissioning Vogtle 4 before the end of this year. She was one of their fuel buyers, as well as helped design their fuel rod bundles for their reactors. So that customer aspect is really important to us. For those of you that don't know, in situ process, we basically go into a aquifer containing uranium in the sandstone as coatings on the sand. We pump the groundwater out of that area. We fortify it with oxygen, adjust the pH with baking soda, and re-inject it. Ours is an alkaline process, not acidic. Pump it through, run it through an ion exchange column, much like a residential or a municipal water treatment plant, and then refortify it, re-inject it, repeat the process. Similarly, when we abandon it and reclaim it, we just quit injecting the oxygen and it stabilizes. CapEx 15% of conventional mines. That's why these are quick to get on board and very, very good projects. You can see the principal uranium processing areas and production areas through history in the left slide, all the green basins. You can see our cluster of concentration in South Texas, and this is where we do intend to achieve our 3 million pound a year run rate within the next 3 years. You can see the schedule of projects to come on board, Rosita Extension, Alta Mesa being the big one. That's a multi-decade project. Rosita will be operated as a satellite facility, as a central plant bringing coated resin in from various field satellite operations, which will include Rosita Extension, Upper Spring Creek, Rosita South. And Mestena Grande is another development project within the Alta Mesa project. You can see longer term, we've got 2 very good projects in South Dakota and Wyoming. And then New Mexico, which is historically the largest producer and largest resources in the U.S., we've got roughly 50% of the mineral rights in that district. It's going to take a lot of work with the Aboriginal communities to bring them along, and going to have to be some sort of a partnership in order to do that. So I'll tell you about our pipeline projects first and then leave you with some ideas on Texas. This is a Powder River Basin. You can see there the red stars have been producers. Many of those are on standby now. Green stars are projects under development. Just to give you an idea, where the Dewey Burdock project is right on the state line. And the Gas Hills is about 250, 300 miles to the west of that, both in historically active areas for mining. Gas Hills has about 7.7 million pounds of ISR resources, 43101, 2021 pre-feasibility study. Dewey Burdock is 17 million and growing. And here again, those are scheduled for, I think, 2026. And we're through our federal permitting. I have one challenge left on an EPA permit on Dewey Burdock. We've just started in Wyoming. Wyoming and Texas are agreement states. That means you don't deal with the federal NRC, which means it's a whole lot quicker to permit. And that's why it's a horse race, even though Dewey Burdock is much further along. Gas Hills just started. It's going to be a toss-up as to which one's ready to go. So here's showing you our land holdings in New Mexico, along with our lead project, Crown Point Hosta Butte, where we share a license. Laramide, who you'll hear from shortly, actually owns the license, but it covers not only their ground but ours, but it is fully permitted under NRC, so we have a good relation with Laramide and Mark. South Texas operations, here again, just to illustrate, this is a truck full of coated resin delivering to a plant when it was last in operation back about 2008. Same process we'll be using at Rosita. Quick map showing you all the satellite locations. All of our activities in South Texas are within about a 100-mile radius, which will be very efficient for achieving our buildup and our rate, feeding all of those 3 plants, with Rosita first and Alta Mesa second. Alta Mesa is over 200,000 acres. To show up on a map of the state of Texas, it's a heck of a big land holding. So 80,000 hectares. And over 50 miles of identified uranium-containing roll fronts, and we've only touched about 10% of that in terms of drilling it out. It does have a 2 million pound a year capacity for drying, 1.5 million pounds a year for standard production through in situ means. Rosita and Kingsville are both 800,000 pound a year capacity. You can increase capacity in Texas. Show you a little bit of background here while I talk. One of the big advantages to our plants in Texas is they're governed by their radiation output, which is minimal, but that's the threshold. So we can increase our production rate without going back and re-permitting. All we have to do is install more equipment, more pumps and plumbing. And the one difference I'd call out at that point, we aren't really a mining company. We're more akin to an oil and gas company. I mean, our whole life is centered around pumps and wells and plumbing. And in fact, we aren't even regulated by MSHA, it's OSHA. So we really are much more akin to the oil and gas industry. What you see here is the Alta Mesa plant and miles of trunk lines. One of the big advantages to being in Texas is the weather. We can lay these trunk lines and all of our plumbing between the wells out on the surface, simply because we don't get the freezing weather. And we can build our plant out in the open, as you can see. As soon as you move to Wyoming and South Dakota, we're the same as anybody else. We're going to have to enclose those plants, winterize them. We're going to have to bury our plumbing down to the freeze line. And then what you don't realize, so that's a lot more expensive. The other thing you don't realize is when you get done with reclamation, you have to dig all that stuff back up and cover it in. So really some advantages. Here you can see a well field being installed. This is Alta Mesa. It's our first well field. And the wells are drilled approximately every 100 feet. Typically, everyone that knows about ISR is familiar with 5 spots, where you drill basically the 4 rectangular holes and then one in the middle for your production well. We use a lot of line drive here, whereas alternating injection production wells. Most of the roll front deposits in the U.S. for ISR are fairly narrow, so you really don't get too many typical 5 spots until you're right in the guts of it. But here again, that's why we've got a very strong engineering team. And virtually everyone in the field has either been part of the Energy Metals team before or part of the team Paul Goranson had. So with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Bill. Any questions from the floor?
Bill,
Mark.
How common is it?
Sorry.
Bill, Bill, how common is the alkali leach process versus the acidic?
In the U.S., it's virtually dominated by it. In fact, they've tried various different oxidants. That's basically what we're doing is reversing the redox reaction at the roll front. Uranium would much prefer to be in solution than be in a mineral form. And it'll go into solution with acid, base, it doesn't matter. And so we try and do it with the alkaline. They've used ammonia. There's some serious issues with that. There are a number of them. I don't think there's been an acid operation in the U.S. For the last 30 years until a recent one by Peninsula was permitted under a low pH permit, which is acidic, but not as acidic as they used to be. So here again, one of the issues with it using acid versus a basic solution is the acid is far more efficient at liberating uranium. They get 95, 96%. We only get 85 to 90%. But it's very efficient at liberating everything. And returning that aquifer to a base level that you have to in order to get sign-off is the further you go up on the pH scale, the farther down you go towards acidic, the harder it is to ever get sign-off on a well field. Not saying it can't be done, but it's certainly a lengthy experience. So in our estimation, it's a lot more economical to go straight with the alkaline. The benefits of your ESG policy and your green approach far outweigh the small gain in your recovery.
Do you think there needs to be consolidation, especially in Wyoming, in the ISR market?
Yes. I'd point out that we're keenly aware of that. We've done 3 major transactions, M&A-wise, in 3 years. And the predecessor company, Energy Metals Corp., did 5 of them in 30 months on our way to selling out to Uranium One for $1.8 billion. There has to be. I mean, we can't have a dozen producers, or 5 or 6 even, really. You're going to find that. And a lot of the smaller companies are hesitant to do M&A. There's a lot involved with it, but our team, as I just mentioned, is quite familiar with it and have been through a number of them. So we actually look to it as a very, very valuable accretive tool to our shareholders. I think you'll see more of it coming.
Bill, your team has the ear to the ground in Washington, probably more so than most out there. Yeah. How do you foresee the uranium reserve, which you participated in earlier this year, how do you foresee that playing out next year? Do you think the government's going to double down and purchase $150 million next year?
Yeah, I think you might even see more than that. There's some rumblings, and I think I would go higher on that than lower, and maybe even doubling what you're talking about. I think also the perhaps more important one is the one that comes along a couple of years later for the LEU. You're talking billions of dollars of procurement there. And simple fact of the matter is there's just not. If we were to return all the ISR plants to production, we can produce roughly half or less of the U.S. annual consumption. And that's the existing permitted plants. And that's even if you put the back end on one of them in Wyoming. So we've got some serious supply issues, and we've got some catching up to do. Word out of WNA is there's probably at least a couple of utilities that are having a hard time fueling their next restart or next refuel. And when the consumers actually start admitting that they've got a problem, there's a real problem coming.
I mentioned that this morning during my talk. Not everybody that needs uranium is going to get uranium.
That's
this time
correct,
around.
which I think you're going to see the real squeeze. I still don't think you're going to see the $140. Half of that was hedge fund last time in the last go-around because of supply interruptions. Completely different market this time. This is demand-driven, and I think we're in a healthy market for several decades. I know it's hard to imagine that in the mining industry, but it'll have some ups and downs, but I think we're back to stay for a while.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you.